"I'll leave at dawn," said the rejected mail-order bride. The rancher barred the door, not alone. Ruth Carter had folded the letter so many times that the paper had softened like cloth beneath her fingers. Each crease told a story, of nights spent by candlelight, of whispered prayers spoken when hope felt thinner than breath, of faith stretched until it ached. The envelope bore Elijah Boone's careful handwriting, dark ink pressed with purpose. Ruth had nearly thrown it away when it first arrived. After all, she had learned that promises written by men often dissolved when tested by hardship. But something about the words inside had stopped her. Not romance. Not flattery. Faith. "I am a God-fearing rancher seeking a wife who values scripture, humility, and perseverance. I do not promise wealth, but I promise honesty, protection, and prayer. If the Lord wills, we will build a home together." Ruth had read those lines aloud the first time, her voice trembling. Not because they sounded grand, but because they sounded true. Now, as the train thundered westward through frozen plains, she pressed the letter to her chest like a psalm memorized for survival. Her life had not been easy. At 26, Ruth had already buried both parents within the span of a single year. Illness had taken her mother slowly. A fall from scaffolding had taken her father suddenly. Grief had emptied her home and medical bills had emptied her purse. When the last chair was sold and the last prayer said over an empty hearth, Ruth understood what Scripture meant when it spoke of widows and orphans, not as metaphors but as real souls the world often forgot. She had prayed then, not for comfort but for direction. "Lord," she had whispered on her knees, "show me where to go. I will go where you send me." The letter arrived 2 weeks later. Now the train slowed, metal screaming against iron, steam hissing like breath released after long restraint. Ruth wiped her eyes and gathered her single valise. Everything she owned fit inside it. 2 dresses, her Bible, edges worn thin, and her mother's old shawl, still carrying the faint scent of lavender and home. "Way station," the conductor called. "Last stop." Ruth's heart beat faster. This was it. She stepped down onto the platform, boots crunching against frost. The air was sharp, cold enough to sting her lungs. Snow flurried sideways, clinging to her lashes. The station itself was small, too small. 1 wooden bench. 1 lantern swinging gently in the wind. 1 empty stretch of road disappearing into pale morning. No man waiting. No horse tied nearby. No sign bearing her name. Ruth stood still as passengers hurried past her, coats pulled tight, reunions happening in hushed laughter and firm embraces. One by one the platform emptied. Still no Elijah Boone. A flicker of fear rose in her chest, but she pushed it down. God had not carried her this far to abandon her now. She approached the conductor. "Sir." "The rancher, Elijah Boone, was meant to meet me." He checked his ledger, then shook his head gently. "No one came asking." "I'm sorry, miss." The final whistle blew. Steam engulfed the platform. The train lurched forward and disappeared into the white distance. And just like that, Ruth Carter was alone. The silence pressed in, heavy as a held breath. She stood there, snow settling into her hair, uncertainty threatening to unmake her resolve. Her fingers tightened around the letter. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." She said it aloud this time, her voice small but steady. "I shall not want," she repeated as if reminding her own soul. Ruth lifted her chin and stepped toward the station door. If Elijah Boone was a man of faith, perhaps something delayed him. And if he was not, then God still was. Inside, the station smelled of coal and old wood. The clerk barely glanced up. "You need lodging?" "Yes, sir," Ruth answered. "Just for the night." As she waited, her gaze drifted back toward the door, half expecting it to open any moment. It didn't. Somewhere beyond the hills, Elijah Boone stood at his own window, staring down the same road, unaware that the woman who trusted his words had already arrived. And heaven watched both of them, knowing what fear might try to undo, and what grace was already preparing to redeem. Elijah Boone had not meant to spend the morning staring out the window. The sun rose pale and reluctant over the Wyoming plains, its light stretching across fields once full of promise and now heavy with memory. Elijah stood with one hand braced against the window frame, the other curled into a fist at his side. The road beyond the ranch lay empty, a ribbon of frost and dirt leading to the distant town. It had been years since he last rode it with purpose. Once, he had believed roads were made for beginnings. Now they only reminded him how easily things ended. The letter he had written sat on the table behind him, folded neatly, untouched for days. He had poured prayer into every word, convinced at the time that God was inviting him to hope again. The long nights had been especially cruel that winter. Silence filled the house where laughter once lived, and scripture, once read aloud by firelight, now gathered dust beside the bed. He had prayed out of weariness, not courage. "Lord," he had said one night, voice cracking, "if you see fit to send companionship, I will receive it." Then he had written to Ruth Carter. But when the sheriff's knock came that morning, breathless and insistent, Elijah's resolve faltered. "She arrived early," the sheriff said. "Train came in before dawn. Young woman asking for Elijah Boone." Elijah felt the blood drain from his face. So soon? He had imagined weeks, time to prepare, to steel himself, to bury doubt beneath duty. Instead, fear surged like a flood. Images rose unbidden. A woman standing in his doorway, expecting a future he no longer trusted himself to offer. A home filled again with warmth he might lose all over again. "I can't," Elijah whispered, more to himself than the sheriff. The sheriff frowned. "She's waiting." Elijah turned away. Tell her I was mistaken." The words tasted bitter even as he spoke them. By the time Ruth Carter stood before him that evening, Elijah had rehearsed his refusal 100 times. Each version sounded harsher than the last. Still he said it plainly, convinced honesty was the kindest cruelty. "I made a mistake," he told her, eyes fixed on the floor. "I'm not prepared to take a wife." Ruth did not cry. That, more than anything, unsettled him. She simply nodded as if she had expected nothing else. "I understand," she said softly. "Thank you for your honesty." But when she turned away, Elijah felt something tear loose inside his chest. Now, hours later, he replayed the moment again and again, each time wishing he had said something different. Not to keep her, but to honor her courage. It took courage to step off a train with nothing but faith and a folded letter. Elijah dragged a hand through his hair and finally turned from the window. The house was too quiet. He moved through the rooms slowly, his boots echoing against the floorboards. Everywhere he looked were ghosts of the life he had lost. His late wife's shawl draped over the chair, the chipped teacup still resting by the sink, the Bible they once read together lying unopened on the bedside table. He stopped there. The Bible had been a gift from her. Inscribed inside the cover were words he had not had the strength to read since the funeral. "Trust in the Lord with all your heart." Elijah closed his eyes. "I trusted you once," he whispered. "And you took her." The accusation hung heavy in the air. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. Winter pressed against the house like a warning. He sank into the chair and buried his face in his hands. He had believed refusing Ruth was an act of mercy. But mercy should not leave a man hollow. A knock sounded at the door. Elijah froze. Another knock, gentler this time. "Mr. Boone?" came a hesitant voice. "It's the boarding house owner. The young woman, she's asking if she might stay the night. There's nowhere else." Elijah's chest tightened. "Yes," he said quickly. "Of course. Tell her she may stay." The door closed again, but the weight in Elijah's spirit remained. That night, long after the house had settled into stillness, Elijah lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sound of another soul breathing under his roof. It should have brought comfort. Instead it stirred unease. Down the hall, Ruth prayed quietly. And though Elijah could not hear her words, heaven did. Sometime near midnight, Elijah rose from the bed and reached for the Bible. His fingers trembled as he opened it, unsure where to begin. The pages fell open to a passage he knew by heart yet had avoided for years. "Perfect love casts out fear." Elijah exhaled sharply. Fear. That was the name of the thing he had called wisdom. He read until his eyes burned, memories rising with every verse. His wife's voice, their shared faith, the joy he had once believed God meant to last forever. Grief had taught him to protect himself. Scripture now asked him to trust again. From down the hall came the faint sound of weeping. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just the soft, broken kind that comes from someone who believes God hears even the smallest prayer. Elijah closed the Bible and pressed his palms together. "Lord," he whispered, "what if I'm wrong?" The answer did not come as thunder. It came as conviction. "You asked me for provision. I sent you a soul, not a transaction. Do not send away what I have entrusted." Elijah sat there until dawn's first light crept through the window. When the rooster crowed, he knew what he had to do. He rose, walked to the front door and slid the heavy bar into place, not to keep Ruth in but to keep fear out. Whatever happened next, it would not happen in cowardice. And for the first time in years, Elijah Boone waited for morning not with dread, but with trembling hope. The night stretched long and sleepless, as if even time itself hesitated to move forward. Ruth Carter lay awake on the narrow bed, her hands folded over her Bible, listening to the soft creaks of the old house. The wind whispered through the cracks in the walls, carrying with it the sound of distant cattle and the low moan of winter pressing against the plains. Every sound felt amplified in the silence, each tick of the clock a reminder that dawn was coming, and with it, her departure. She had not cried when Elijah Boone turned her away. She had not cried when she laid her valise at the foot of the bed, preparing to leave with the first light. But now, alone in the darkness, the tears came quietly. Not tears of rejection, she had learned long ago how to endure that, but tears of uncertainty. She had believed, with a faith born of desperation and prayer, that God himself had written Elijah's name into her story. To be wrong about that felt heavier than the cold, heavier than hunger, heavier even than grief. Ruth turned onto her side and stared at the faint glow of moonlight on the wall. "Lord," she whispered, careful not to wake the house, "if I have misunderstood you, forgive me. I do not wish to force my will upon yours." Her fingers traced the worn edge of the Bible. It opened naturally to the book of Ruth, its pages softened by years of familiarity. "Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge." The words pierced her heart. She had left everything to follow what she believed was God's leading. She had not demanded certainty, only direction. And now she stood on the edge of yet another unknown. Still, she resolved not to cling where she was not wanted. Faith, she knew, was not stubbornness. She rose from the bed and knelt on the cold floor. The boards pressed into her knees, grounding her in the moment. "I will leave at dawn," she told the Lord before she ever said the words to Elijah. "I will not stay where I am not called. But if you have a purpose even in this rejection, let me walk away without bitterness." Her prayer lingered in the air long after she returned to the bed. Down the hall, Elijah Boone sat rigid in his chair, unaware of Ruth's words yet restless all the same. He stared at the dark doorway of his bedroom, haunted by the sense that something holy was unfolding just beyond his reach. Ruth did not know he was awake. She did not know that every sound she made stirred him. All she knew was that the night felt unbearably long. When the rooster crowed the first time, her heart clenched. Dawn was near. She dressed quietly, pulling on her boots and wrapping her shawl tight around her shoulders. She paused to smooth the blanket on the bed, a habit learned from her mother, an offering of dignity even in leaving. Then she lifted her valise. Before opening the door, she placed her hand against the wood and breathed a final prayer. "Into your hands, Lord." The hallway was dim. Shadows stretched like questions without answers. She walked softly toward the front door, each step deliberate, each breath steady. She reached for the latch. It would not move. Ruth frowned and tried again, more firmly this time. Nothing. Her heart began to pound. "Elijah?" she called, keeping her voice low. "Sir?" There was a pause, long enough for fear to whisper foolish thoughts. Then his voice answered from the other side of the door. "You're not leaving." Ruth's hand fell from the latch. "I said I would go," she replied, calm but resolute. "I do not wish to impose." "I know what you said," Elijah answered. His voice was steady, but beneath it trembled something raw. "But you're not leaving alone." The door opened slowly. Elijah stood there, the lamplight casting deep shadows across his face. His eyes were red as if he had not slept. In one hand he held a Bible. Ruth's breath caught. "I was wrong," he said before she could speak. "Not about my fear, but about my obedience." She remained silent, unsure whether to hope. "I asked God for provision," Elijah continued. "And when it arrived, I tried to send it away because it didn't come wrapped in safety." Ruth swallowed. "I never wished to burden you." "You didn't," he said firmly. "I burdened myself by refusing what God placed at my door." He stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in. "Sit. Please." Ruth hesitated, then obeyed. Elijah took a breath. "If you still wish to leave when the sun rises, I won't stop you. But before you go, I need to say this. I barred that door not to trap you, but to keep myself from running." Her eyes filled with tears. "I am afraid," he confessed. "But fear is not Lord here." Ruth nodded slowly. "I came trusting God, not certainty. If He is asking me to stay, I will stay. But if this is only comfort for loneliness, I cannot remain." Elijah met her gaze. "Then let us place it before Him." They bowed their heads together in the dim light, two strangers bound not by promise, but by prayer. And as dawn crept toward the horizon, heaven leaned close. Dawn did not rush the plains that morning. It arrived slowly, as if even the sun waited to see what choice would be made inside the Boone house. The lamplight still glowed faintly when Elijah Boone and Ruth Carter lifted their heads from prayer. The silence that followed was not awkward, it was weighty, filled with the kind of stillness that comes after truth has been spoken. Ruth was the first to move. She folded her hands in her lap, her shoulders squared not in defense but in resolve. "I do not wish to remain where fear rules," she said gently. "But I will stay where faith is being learned." Elijah nodded. Her words struck him deeper than rebuke. He had lived under fear so long it had begun to masquerade as wisdom. But faith, he was learning, did not demand certainty, it demanded obedience. "I barred the door because I didn't trust myself," he said quietly. "Not because I didn't trust you." Ruth looked toward the door, its heavy wooden bar still in place. "In Scripture," she said softly, "a door closed by God cannot be opened. But a door closed by fear must be." Elijah crossed the room and lifted the bar. It came away easily in his hands. "I will not keep you by force," he said. "Nor will I send you away to protect my comfort." The door stood open now. Cold morning air slipped inside, carrying with it the scent of frost and new light. Ruth did not move. Instead, she rose and walked to the window. Outside, the land stretched wide and waiting, fields still bare from winter yet rich with promise. She remembered the story of Ruth the Moabite, gleaning in a field not her own, uncertain yet faithful. She had always loved that story, not because it promised romance but because it honored quiet obedience. "Elijah," she said at last, "when I stepped off the train, I believed God had led me here. When you turned me away, I believed I had misunderstood him. But now I believe he was teaching us both how to listen." Elijah felt his throat tighten. "I don't know how to be brave," he admitted. "I only know how to try." "That is all faith has ever asked," Ruth replied. They shared a simple meal as the sky brightened, bread, coffee gone lukewarm. It was not a feast but it felt sacred. Every glance held meaning. Every silence carried prayer. Later, Elijah took Ruth outside. The sun finally broke over the horizon, spilling gold across the land. He stopped near the edge of the field and gestured outward. "This land has been barren for years," he said. "Not because it couldn't produce, but because I stopped tending it." Ruth understood. God often restores the ground before he restores the heart. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as an answer to prayer or a problem to solve, but as a woman of faith who had chosen to stay when leaving would have been easier. "If you remain," he said carefully, "it must be as my equal. Free to leave. Free to speak. Free to trust God above me." Ruth nodded. "And if I stay, it will be because God asked me to, not because I had nowhere else to go." They stood there a long while, the wind tugging at Ruth's shawl. Finally, Elijah reached out, not to take her hand, but to place his coat around her shoulders. The gesture was deliberate, protective, honorable. "In our tradition," he said quietly, "a man covers a woman to show intention." Ruth's breath caught, not in surprise but in reverence. She did not lean away. "Then let us walk in intention," she said. "Not haste." That afternoon, word spread quickly through town. Some spoke kindly. Others whispered. But Elijah did not shrink from their eyes. For the first time in years he stood tall, not in pride but in peace. That night, as Ruth returned to her room, she paused at the door. "I meant what I said," she told him. "If dawn comes and God tells me to leave, I will." Elijah nodded. "And if dawn comes and he tells you to stay?" She smiled faintly. "Then we will listen together." The door closed, not barred this time but rested. And as night settled again over the plains, two hearts lay awake, not afraid of morning but waiting for it. Spring did not arrive all at once. It came the way healing often did, slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if the land itself feared disappointment. The snow retreated inch by inch from the fields, leaving behind dark soil still stiff with cold. The mornings remained sharp but the afternoons softened. Life returned cautiously, testing the air before committing. So did Ruth. She did not step into Elijah Boone's world as a bride, nor even as a promise. She stepped into it as a worker. At dawn each morning, Ruth rose quietly and dressed with care, tying her hair back, smoothing her dress, and whispering a prayer before placing her feet on the floor. "Establish the work of my hands, Lord." Elijah watched her from a distance at first, unsure how to act in the presence of something so fragile and yet so strong. He had known women before, his late wife most of all, but Ruth was different. She did not demand space in his life. She made room for God in it. She worked alongside the ranch hands without complaint, her hands blistering, her back aching. She learned the rhythms of the land, the moods of the animals, the silent language of men who spoke little but observed much. She did not seek favor. She earned respect. When one of the hands scoffed quietly, "Mail order bride thinks she's a rancher now," Elijah corrected him without raising his voice. "She is here by my invitation," he said, "and under my protection." The words surprised him as much as they silenced the man. At meals, Ruth listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, it was with kindness and scripture woven naturally into conversation, not as preaching but as living truth. One evening, as the men lingered over stew, a hired hand complained bitterly about the hard winter. Ruth spoke gently. "My mother used to say the ground rests before it produces. Perhaps the land has been praying." The table grew quiet. Elijah felt something stir in his chest. He had forgotten how faith could sound when spoken without desperation. At night, Ruth read by lamplight, often aloud if Elijah was nearby. Psalms, Proverbs, the Gospels. Sometimes Elijah listened from the hallway, pretending to busy himself with chores. Her voice carried peace into corners of the house long untouched. One night he finally sat across from her. "What makes you trust God so completely?" he asked. Ruth looked up, surprised by the question. She considered it carefully. "I don't," she said honestly. "Not completely. But every time I tried trusting myself instead, I was left empty. God may take me through loss, but He has never wasted it." Elijah swallowed hard. The past did not vanish. Grief did not dissolve overnight. Some days, Elijah withdrew without explanation, memories overtaking him. Ruth never pressed. She prayed instead. She prayed while hanging laundry. She prayed while mending clothes. She prayed while walking the fields at dusk. Elijah noticed the change, not just in her but in himself. He found himself returning to Scripture not out of guilt but hunger. He knelt again, not because he feared judgment but because he longed for guidance. One night, unable to sleep, he confessed what he had never said aloud. "I was angry at God," he admitted, staring into the fire. "I thought obedience would spare me pain." Ruth did not correct him. She simply said, "Obedience does not spare us pain. It spares us from being alone in it." The fire crackled softly. In the weeks that followed, something holy took root, not passion, not possession, but trust. Elijah began to include Ruth in decisions about the ranch. She offered wisdom without control, insight without presumption. Together they planned repairs, rotated grazing, prepared for planting. The land responded. Grass returned where it had thinned. Calves were born healthy. Even the old orchard showed signs of life. One afternoon, Elijah stood watching Ruth work beneath the open sky. She laughed quietly with one of the women from town, her face alight with joy untainted by fear. The sight undid him. He realized then that love had not left him when his wife died. It had simply waited. That evening, as the sun bled gold across the horizon, Elijah approached Ruth with a folded coat in his hands. "The nights are still cold," he said. He placed it around her shoulders, not hurried, not uncertain. The gesture held weight. "In Scripture," he said quietly, "a man covers a woman when he intends to protect her future." Ruth met his eyes, her voice steady though her heart raced. "Then let the covering be prayer before promise." Elijah nodded. "Always." They bowed their heads together. And heaven once again bore witness to two souls choosing faith over fear, one day at a time. By the time summer began to press its warmth into the plains, everyone knew. They did not need to be told outright. Towns like this learned things the way fields learned weather, by watching, by listening, by drawing conclusions long before words were spoken. Ruth Carter no longer walked as a stranger. She greeted shopkeepers by name. She helped the pastor's wife with mending. Children ran toward her without fear, tugging at her skirts, asking questions that only the honest could answer. She carried herself not as someone seeking approval, but as someone at peace with obedience. And that unsettled some people. There were whispers, of course. There always were. She came with nothing. He turned her away once. A man like Elijah Boone doesn't change. The words reached Ruth eventually. They always did. But she did not answer them, not with defense, not with explanation. She answered them with faithfulness. Elijah heard the whispers too. At first he pretended not to. He had lived long enough with other men's opinions to know they could not be fed without growing. But something had changed in him. He no longer measured his choices by how they would be judged, only by whether they would be obedient. The test came on a Sunday morning. The church was full, sunlight spilling through the narrow windows, dust motes dancing in the beams. Elijah and Ruth sat several pews apart as they always did, preserving propriety, honoring process. Still, the space between them felt charged, like a question waiting for God to answer. The sermon was from the book of Ruth. The pastor spoke of Boaz, a man of standing who chose to cover a woman others saw as a liability. He spoke of obedience not as obligation but as courage. He spoke of redemption being a public act, not a private comfort. Elijah felt each word land squarely on his chest. If you cover her, you do so openly. After the service, a man Elijah respected approached him. You going to do right by that woman? The man asked plainly. Not accusing. Not kind. Just honest. Elijah did not hesitate. Yes. The answer surprised them both. That evening, the sky turned heavy with the promise of rain. Ruth was folding laundry when Elijah found her on the porch. The air smelled of dust and change. There's talk, he said quietly. Ruth nodded. I know. You don't have to stay, he continued. I won't ask you to carry the weight of my reputation. She looked up at him then, eyes steady. If God thought my strength was insufficient, he would not have brought me here. The rain began to fall, slow, deliberate drops against the dry ground. Elijah reached for his coat and placed it over her shoulders. This time the gesture was different. This time it was witnessed. I choose to cover you, he said clearly, his voice carrying beyond the porch, beyond the moment. Before God. Before this land. Before anyone who doubts your worth. Ruth's breath caught, not in surprise but in reverence. Then I choose to remain, she said. Not because I am hidden, but because I am honored. The rain strengthened, soaking the ground, sealing the moment. From that day on things shifted. Elijah no longer allowed Ruth to be spoken of lightly. When a merchant made a crude remark, Elijah ended the transaction. When a neighbor questioned her place, Elijah answered with calm authority. She is under my protection. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He simply stood. At night, he prayed aloud again, for wisdom, for humility, for patience. Ruth listened from the other room, her heart full, her spirit steady. One evening she joined him. They knelt together, not touching, not rushing. Elijah, she said after the prayer ended, covering is not ownership. I know, he replied. It is responsibility. She smiled faintly. Then let us carry it together. Outside, the land drank deeply of the rain. And in the quiet strength of obedience made visible, God prepared the final act of redemption, one that would require not just faith but public commitment. The call for witnesses came quietly, but its weight was unmistakable. Elijah Boone did not announce his intention with fanfare. He did not ride through town boasting resolve. Instead, he walked with measured steps to the places that mattered. The church, the elders' table, the edge of the field where business was conducted and covenants were remembered. Redemption, he had learned, was not something to be whispered. It was something to be stood for. Ruth sensed the shift before words reached her. There was a stillness in Elijah now, no longer tentative, no longer learning, but settled as if a decision made in heaven had finally reached the earth. One morning as she worked near the orchard, Elijah approached her with his hat in his hands. He did not speak at first. He simply stood there, reverent as one might stand on holy ground. I have spoken to the elders, he said at last. I have spoken to the pastor. And I have prayed. Ruth set aside her basket. Her heart beat steadily, not wildly. She had learned not to rush God's answers. And, she asked, and I will not delay obedience any longer. The wind stirred her shawl. She waited. I am prepared, Elijah continued, voice firm, to redeem what I once feared. To claim responsibility before God and man. To take you as my wife, if you will still have me. Ruth's eyes filled, not with surprise but with recognition. She had known this moment would come. Not because she had planned it but because faith had prepared her for it. I will, she said simply. But only because the Lord has gone before you, and before me. They bowed their heads together beneath the open sky. The wedding was set for the following Sunday. It was not elaborate. It was not grand. But it was holy. The altar was built in the open field, Elijah's land, once barren, now softened by months of faithful tending. Wildflowers bloomed where nothing had grown the year before. The ground itself seemed to testify. The congregation gathered slowly, some curious, some reverent, some still uncertain. But no one denied the change they had seen. Ruth walked forward alone at first, her steps measured, her expression peaceful. She wore no veil of illusion. Only the quiet dignity of a woman who had chosen obedience over escape. When she reached the altar, Elijah stepped forward to meet her. Not as a rescuer. Not as an owner. But as a redeemer. The pastor opened the scripture to the book of Ruth. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, You are witnesses this day. Elijah lifted his head. I was afraid, he said openly, his voice carrying across the field. Afraid to hope. Afraid to love. Afraid that obedience would cost me more than I could bear. He turned to Ruth. But this woman trusted God when she had every reason not to. And through her faith, God restored mine. Ruth took his hands, steady and warm. I came prepared to leave, she said. I asked nothing but direction. And God answered, not by sparing me hardship but by meeting me in it. The pastor nodded. Do you, Elijah Boone, take Ruth Carter, not as a burden but as a blessing, to love, to protect, and to lead in humility under God? I do, Elijah said. Before heaven and earth. And do you, Ruth Carter, take Elijah Boone, not as a refuge but as a partner, to walk beside in faith, obedience, and truth? I do, Ruth replied, her voice unwavering. The vows were spoken plainly. No promises of ease. No illusions of perfection. Only covenant. When Elijah placed his coat around Ruth's shoulders one final time, it was no longer a symbol. It was a declaration. The pastor lifted his hands. What God has joined together, let no fear put asunder. As they kissed, the congregation exhaled, as if something long awaited had finally been completed. Later, as the sun dipped low and the guests drifted away, Elijah and Ruth stood alone at the edge of the field. I almost lost this, Elijah admitted, because I believed fear more than faith. Ruth smiled softly. But fear did not have the final word. They turned toward their home together, not rushing, not looking back. Behind them the land stood redeemed. And before them, a future built not on certainty, but on covenant. Years did not rush past the Boone Ranch. They unfolded the way God often works, steadily, intentionally, without spectacle, yet unmistakably purposeful. Seasons came and went, each one leaving its mark upon the land and the people who tended it. What had once been a place of silence and sorrow grew loud with life, prayer, and gratitude. Elijah Boone often rose before dawn, not out of restlessness as he once had, but out of peace. He would step onto the porch while the world still slept, breathing in the cool air, listening to the low sounds of cattle stirring and birds greeting the day. And always, he would glance back through the window. Ruth was there. Sometimes reading scripture by the fire. Sometimes kneading dough, her sleeves rolled, her movements familiar and sure. Sometimes rocking a child in her arms, humming the same hymn her mother once sang to her long ago. Each time Elijah saw her, the same truth settled anew in his heart. He was not alone. The house that once echoed with grief now bore the gentle wear of shared life, scratches on the table from daily meals, laughter lingering in the corners, prayers spoken aloud without hesitation. Scripture was no longer a relic of memory but the language of their days. They prayed before decisions. They prayed in uncertainty. They prayed in gratitude. And when hardship came, as it always does, they did not ask why God had failed them. They asked where he was leading them next. Ruth walked the land with familiarity now, no longer a stranger gleaning at the edges, but a steward of what God had entrusted. She taught the younger women of town not merely how to sew or bake, but how to listen, to God, to wisdom, to conviction. She spoke openly of her journey, not as testimony to strength, but as evidence of grace. I came ready to leave, she would say. But God closed a door so I would not walk away from his provision. Elijah listened from a distance when she spoke, humility softening his pride. He never forgot the morning he barred the door, not to control her but to confront himself. He often wondered how close he had come to missing God's redemption because he mistook fear for caution. One evening years later, as the sky burned orange and gold, Elijah sat beside Ruth on the porch. Their children played nearby, laughter rising like incense. I used to believe God answered prayers by removing pain, Elijah said quietly. Ruth rested her head against his shoulder. He answers them by staying present. Elijah nodded. He did both, eventually. They sat in silence, watching the land, fields once barren now abundant, fruit trees heavy with promise, fences strong and tended. It was more than prosperity. It was restoration. When winter returned, it no longer felt cruel. Snow gathered on the roof, fires burned warm, and stories were told. Elijah read scripture aloud while Ruth mended by lamplight, their voices blending in quiet harmony. Sometimes Elijah would pause mid-verse, overcome by gratitude. I almost sent all this away, he would whisper. Ruth would squeeze his hand. But you listened. And that, she knew, had made all the difference. As the years pressed onward, Elijah grew slower, his steps more measured. One morning, unable to rise as quickly as before, he remained seated by the fire while Ruth prepared breakfast. She noticed immediately. You don't have to be strong today, she told him gently. He smiled. I don't need to be. God has been. That afternoon, Elijah called their family together. I once believed faith was proven by endurance, he said. But I have learned it is proven by surrender. He looked at Ruth, eyes full. You were God's answer long before you were my wife. Ruth bowed her head, tears slipping free. And you were God's lesson in obedience. When Elijah eventually passed from this world, it was not in fear. It was in peace. Ruth sat beside him, holding his hand, whispering scripture into the stillness. I will not leave you nor forsake you, she said, voice steady even as her heart broke. Elijah smiled faintly. He kept his word. The land mourned him. The town remembered him. But heaven received him. Years later, Ruth would sit on the same porch, now older, children grown, grandchildren gathered at her feet. She would tell them the story, the true story. Once, she would say, I planned to leave at dawn. And why didn't you, Mama? A small voice would ask. Ruth would smile toward the horizon. Because God barred the door, and told me I was never meant to walk alone. And under the wide western sky, the truth remained unshaken. What God begins in faith, He completes in covenant. What fear tries to end, grace redeems. And no one who trusts in the Lord is ever truly alone.